Imagine being excited for your first solo adventure at just 14, only to be unfairly humiliated and kicked off a flight for reasons unclear. Now picture a father, a quiet but determined airport security guard, forced to make a choice: fight for his daughter's dignity or stay silent as the system tramples justice. This is a story about courage, resilience, and standing up for what's right. Stick around because this journey will inspire you to confront injustice head on. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more impactful stories. The summer heat hung heavily over Asheville Regional Airport, where the hum of rolling suitcases and the murmur of passengers created a symphony of controlled chaos. Families jostled through check-in lines, business travelers stared at their phones, and children darted between the legs of hurried adults. The small but bustling airport served as the gateway to North Carolina's picturesque Blue Ridge Mountains, its charm offset by the subtle tension that always seemed to linger in the air. Gideon Carter adjusted the collar of his security uniform, his eyes scanning the crowd instinctively. After 10 years working here, he could identify the slightest disruption before it happened. He wasn't on duty today, though. He was here as a father, not a guard. His daughter, Emily, clutched her backpack and a rolled-up paperback book, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Dad, this is going to be so cool," she said, her voice a mix of nervousness and exhilaration. "It's my first flight all by myself. Grandma's waiting on the other side. No pressure, right?" Gideon chuckled softly, but a protective edge lingered in his smile. "You've got everything? Ticket, ID, phone charged?" Emily rolled her eyes in mock exasperation. "Yes, Dad. I double-checked everything. I'm not a kid." To Gideon, she would always be his little girl. Watching her take these independent steps both filled him with pride and churned a quiet worry in his gut. He handed her the envelope containing her boarding pass and ID. "All right, stay alert. If anything feels off, you call me immediately. Got it?" She nodded, offering him a quick hug before stepping into the line for security. As she moved forward, Gideon stayed rooted, his eyes following her every move. The crowd swallowed her small frame, but she stood out to him like a beacon. She was confident, ready, but still, he couldn't shake the gnawing unease at the back of his mind. Across the terminal, Sandra Miller observed the line of passengers with a practiced disinterest. As the senior flight attendant for one of the regional airlines, she had seen it all. Too much, in fact. Her sharp eyes swept over the crowd, pausing on Emily as the girl approached the boarding gate. Something flickered across Sandra's face, a shadow of disdain, barely perceptible, but impossible for Gideon to miss. From where he stood, Gideon narrowed his eyes. Sandra's demeanor struck him as odd, though he couldn't immediately put his finger on why. She leaned toward a younger gate attendant, speaking in hushed tones, and glanced back at Emily. It wasn't the first time Gideon had seen people look at him, or his daughter, with that expression. Asheville had changed over the years, but not enough. Emily handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who scanned it and smiled. "Have a great flight," the agent chirped. Emily grinned back, her confidence restored, and walked toward the jet bridge. For a moment, Gideon felt a wave of relief. She was boarding without issue. Then Sandra stepped forward. Her expression shifted, lips tightening as she intercepted Emily at the entrance to the jet bridge. The girl turned to look back, confusion etched across her face. Sandra waved her forward brusquely, gesturing for her to step aside. Gideon's heart sank as he saw the hesitation in Emily's posture. She glanced back again, her movements uncertain. Sandra leaned down, her voice too low for Gideon to hear, but her gestures were curt, commanding. Emily shook her head slightly, clutching her backpack as if it were a lifeline. Gideon's protective instincts kicked in. He moved toward the gate area, keeping his distance but positioning himself to see what was happening. Emily's boarding pass was now in Sandra's hands, and her tone grew sharper, her body language rigid. Sandra handed the boarding pass back to the younger attendant, who looked flustered. Emily stepped back, her expression a mix of confusion and anxiety. Sandra gestured for her to step out of the boarding queue entirely. From across the terminal, Gideon clenched his fists, his pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. Emily's expression froze as Sandra Miller waved her out of the line. Confusion turned to panic as the gate attendant reluctantly followed Sandra's lead, motioning for Emily to step aside. The clamor of the bustling airport faded into background noise for Gideon as he watched his daughter hesitate, her small frame dwarfed by the sterile metal walls of the gate. "Miss, I'm going to need to verify your documents," Sandra said, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. Emily hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the crowd. She extended her boarding pass and ID with shaky hands, her earlier excitement now replaced by apprehension. Sandra glanced at the documents briefly before handing them back with a dismissive shake of her head. "I'm sorry, but this isn't sufficient for a minor traveling alone." Emily's voice wavered. "But my dad said it's all fine. I have everything I need." Sandra crossed her arms. "It's not about what your father thinks. You'll need to step aside until we can confirm everything." From his vantage point, Gideon saw Emily's face flush with embarrassment. He felt an instinctive pull, his legs already carrying him forward, before he could fully process what was happening. "Excuse me," Gideon called out, his tone calm but firm as he approached. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sandra turned to face him, her expression hardening as she sized him up. "Are you the guardian?" she asked, her voice tinged with a condescending edge. "Yes, I'm her father," Gideon replied, keeping his voice steady even as his pulse quickened. "And I made sure she had everything required for this flight. Her ID and boarding pass are valid." Sandra's eyes flicked to Emily, then back to Gideon. "Well, it's not up to you to decide what's valid. There are protocols, and right now, her paperwork doesn't meet our standards for unaccompanied minors." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Then explain to me what's missing. She has her ID, her boarding pass, and I've filled out every form your airline requested." Sandra didn't flinch. "Sir, I don't need to explain myself to you. Step back, and we'll handle it." The dismissiveness in her tone ignited a spark of anger in Gideon, but he held his ground. "You're not handling it," he said, his voice firm. "You're intimidating a 14-year-old girl for no reason. Let's bring over a supervisor and sort this out." Sandra raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If that's what you want." The younger gate attendant hesitated before stepping away to call a manager. Meanwhile, Emily tugged at Gideon's sleeve, her voice trembling. "Dad, it's okay. Maybe I can just, try another flight." Gideon knelt beside her, lowering his voice. "No, sweetheart. You've done nothing wrong. You're getting on that plane." Moments later, a man in a navy blazer approached, one of the floor supervisors. His name tag read Stephen Hensley, and his expression was already strained as he glanced between Sandra and Gideon. "What's the issue here?" Stephen asked, his tone weary. Sandra gestured toward Emily. "The documentation for this passenger doesn't meet the airline's requirements for unaccompanied minors. I was following protocol." Gideon interjected before Stephen could respond. "Her documentation is complete. If there's a problem, I'd like a clear explanation as to why she's being denied boarding." Stephen's brow furrowed. He took Emily's boarding pass and ID from Sandra and examined them closely. "Everything looks fine to me," he admitted, his tone cautious. "We usually see these forms for minors traveling alone. It should be sufficient." Sandra stiffened. "The responsibility falls on us to ensure safety. If I have concerns, I have the authority to deny boarding." "And what exactly are your concerns?" Gideon pressed, his patience thinning. Sandra's gaze remained steady, but her tone sharpened. "Sir, I don't appreciate your tone. This isn't about you. You don't have the right to interfere in airline operations." Gideon took a measured breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders mount. "I'm interfering because you're denying my daughter access to a flight she's fully prepared for. If there's a valid reason, I'll respect it. But I need to hear that reason now." Stephen glanced nervously at Sandra, clearly reluctant to undermine her authority. After a long pause, he said, "Perhaps it's best if we let her take the next flight. It'll give us time to sort out any confusion." Emily's voice broke through the tense exchange. "Why can't I just get on this one? I didn't do anything wrong." Her words struck Gideon like a blow. He turned to Stephen, his voice quieter but no less resolute. "My daughter shouldn't have to wait because someone can't admit they're wrong. She's getting on that flight." Sandra folded her arms. "Not unless I'm satisfied with the documentation. It's my call." Gideon felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Should he escalate further and risk making the situation worse for Emily, or should he step back, regroup, and fight another day. The stares from other passengers, the quiet hum of whispers behind them, it all added to the pressure. Emily looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Dad, please, let's just go home." The car ride home was unbearably silent. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring blankly out the window. Her quiet sniffles were the only sound breaking the stillness. Gideon gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as the weight of his own helplessness pressed down on him. He glanced at her briefly, the sight of her tear-streaked face cutting through him like a blade. "Emily," he began softly, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry, I should have done more back there." Emily didn't turn to face him. "It's not your fault, Dad. You tried," she murmured, her tone flat and detached. But the words felt hollow, as if they were more for his benefit than her own belief. He wanted to argue, to promise her that this wasn't the end of it, but the lump in his throat made it impossible. The truth was, he had failed her. He had stood there, a man who had dedicated a decade of his life to ensuring safety and fairness in that very airport, and he couldn't even protect his own daughter. By the time they pulled into the driveway, Emily was already wiping at her eyes, determined to put up a strong front. She climbed out of the car without a word and disappeared inside. Gideon remained in the driver's seat, staring at the dashboard as a torrent of emotions swirled within him. Anger, shame, and an overwhelming need to make things right. After a few minutes, he stepped out, the cool evening air doing little to ease his tension. He watched the house for a moment, the warm glow of the living room light spilling onto the porch. Emily would be okay eventually. She was strong, just like her mother had been. But tonight, he needed answers. He slid back into the car and headed toward the airport. The building loomed in the distance, its illuminated signage casting an eerie glow against the darkening sky. The once familiar sight now felt tainted, a symbol of the injustice his daughter had faced. Gideon parked near the employee entrance and used his badge to gain access to the restricted areas. Despite being off duty, the quarters felt like home, a home that had betrayed him today. As he walked past security checkpoints and waiting areas, Gideon couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something deeper was at play. This wasn't just a mistake or an overzealous application of protocol. Sandra Miller's actions had been deliberate, calculated. But why? He stopped near the break room, where a group of employees chatted in hushed tones. Recognizing one of his colleagues, a younger man named Marcus, Gideon approached. Marcus looked up, surprised but wary. "Gideon," Marcus greeted, his voice cautious. "Didn't think I'd see you back here tonight. Everything okay?" Gideon forced a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Not really. I need to ask you something about one of the flight attendants, Sandra Miller. You know her?" Marcus's expression faltered, and he glanced around before lowering his voice. "Yeah, I know her. Why?" "She denied my daughter boarding earlier today, claimed her paperwork wasn't sufficient, but everything was in order. I want to know if this is normal for her." Marcus hesitated, clearly torn. After a long pause, he leaned closer. "Look, I'm not supposed to talk about this, but she's had complaints before. Passengers, co-workers, you name it. But nothing ever sticks." Gideon frowned. "Complaints about what?" Marcus's voice dropped further. "Let's just say she has a certain attitude, especially toward passengers who don't fit her idea of normal." His eyes darted nervously to the hallway. "But she's connected, protected even. People have tried to report her, but it always gets swept under the rug." The revelation hit Gideon like a gut punch. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed stoked the fire of his anger. "Protected by who?" he demanded. Marcus shook his head quickly. "I don't know, man. I've already said too much. Just be careful if you're planning to go after her." Before Gideon could press further, Marcus excused himself, disappearing into the break room. Gideon remained rooted to the spot, his mind racing. If Sandra had a history of behavior like this, why was she still in a position of authority? And who was shielding her? Determined to dig deeper, he headed toward the operations desk, where employee schedules and incident reports were stored. It didn't take long for him to find Sandra's name, prominently listed as part of the day's crew. But what caught his eye was a separate file, a list marked Special Passenger Notifications. His pulse quickened as he scanned the names. Toward the bottom of the list in bold letters was Sandra Miller, Discretionary Authority. Gideon's brow furrowed. Why did she have a designation like this? And more importantly, who had given it to her? He stared at the list, questions mounting with every passing second. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Gideon sat on the worn couch in his living room, the dim glow of a table lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The house was quiet. Emily had retreated to her room, her door shut tight, and the stillness weighed heavily on him. His mind churned with questions. The name Sandra Miller etched into his thoughts like a brand. The discovery of her discretionary authority gnawed at him, a thread that begged to be unraveled. But he needed help, someone who could see through the layers of bureaucracy and shield him from the inevitable blowback. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name, Lila Henderson. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It had been years since they last spoke, but if anyone could help him make sense of this mess, it was Lila. The line rang twice before her familiar voice answered. Gideon Carter, it's been a long time. To what do I owe the pleasure? Her voice carried a warmth that reminded him of their shared past, but there was also an edge to it, a hint of someone who had seen too much of the world's injustice. Lila, I need your help, he said, his tone more serious than he intended. Something happened today, to Emily. There was a pause on the other end. What happened? She asked, her voice softening. He explained everything, the incident at the airport, Sandra's actions, and the troubling file he'd found. Lila listened without interruption. The silence on her end waited with unspoken questions. When he finished, there was a long pause. This isn't the first time I've heard about Sandra Miller, Lila finally said, her voice low. She's come up in other cases, discrimination, abuse of authority, but nothing ever sticks. The airline's lawyers are relentless, and they bury everything under mountains of paperwork. Gideon felt a knot tighten in his stomach. So she just gets away with it? Every time? Not if we fight back, Lila replied. But you need to understand something, Gideon. This isn't going to be easy. Cases like this can take months, even years. They'll come after you, your job, maybe even your family. Gideon's jaw tightened. They already went after my family. Emily doesn't deserve what happened to her. There was a brief silence before Lila spoke again. All right, I'll help you. But we need to be smart about this. Do you have any concrete evidence? I found her name on a discretionary authority list, Gideon said. It didn't explain much, but it's clear she's been given special privileges. That's a start, Lila said. But it's not enough. We'll need more. Witnesses, documentation, anything that proves a pattern of behavior, and we'll need to tread carefully. These companies don't play fair. Gideon sighed, the weight of her words sinking in. What do we do first? First, Lila said, I'll reach out to some contacts and see if I can dig up past complaints against Sandra or the airline. In the meantime, you need to document everything, every detail, every conversation. Don't leave anything out. Her pragmatic tone gave him a small glimmer of hope. Lila had always been a fighter, someone who didn't back down from a challenge. He trusted her implicitly, but the enormity of what lay ahead was daunting. As they discussed the next steps, Gideon couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Was he doing the right thing? Pursuing this could cost him his job, his reputation, and potentially expose Emily to even more scrutiny. The thought of her being dragged through the public eye made his stomach churn, but then he remembered her tears in the car, the way her voice had cracked when she said, "Let's just go home." This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about every person who had been humiliated, dismissed, or silenced. Gideon didn't know how he'd find the strength to see this through, but he knew he couldn't back down. Lila interrupted his thoughts. One more thing, Gideon. You need to know what you're up against. That airline, this isn't their first rodeo. They've been sued before for discrimination. His breath caught. What happened? They settled, she said grimly. Quietly. No admission of guilt, just a payout to make the problem go away. It's their standard playbook. Gideon leaned back on the couch, his mind racing. A settlement might make sense for someone looking to avoid the fight, but for him it wasn't about money. It was about justice. For Emily, for himself, and for anyone else who had been wronged. Lila's voice brought him back. Are you ready for this? Once we start, there's no turning back. Gideon closed his eyes, the image of Emily's tearful face seared into his memory. I'm ready, he said. As he hung up, the house felt quieter than ever. But within that silence was a simmering resolve. This wasn't just a fight for his daughter, it was a fight for everything he believed in. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Gideon was up early, sipping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, his mind still swirling with the events of the previous day. The tension in the house was palpable. Emily hadn't come out of her room, and Gideon didn't have the heart to press her. The shrill ring of his phone shattered the quiet. He reached for it, frowning at the unknown number on the screen. This is Gideon, he answered, his voice heavy with fatigue. You need to check social media, a familiar voice said urgently. It was Marcus, his co-worker from the airport. There's a video. It's everywhere. What video? Gideon asked, his heart beginning to race. Someone filmed the whole thing with your daughter and Sandra. It's gone viral. Gideon's stomach dropped as he hung up and immediately searched for the video. It didn't take long to find. The grainy footage showed Emily standing at the boarding gate, her small frame dwarfed by Sandra's imposing figure. Sandra's voice, sharp and cutting, carried over the noise of the terminal as she spoke to Emily with a coldness that made Gideon's blood boil. Step aside! You're holding up the line, Sandra barked, her words punctuated by an air of irritation. Emily's hesitant responses only highlighted the imbalance of power between them. The caption beneath the video read, Racist flight attendant denies young girl boarding. The post had already racked up thousands of likes, shares, and comments. Gideon scrolled through them, his chest tightening as he read the mixed reactions. This is disgusting. Fire Sandra Miller? One comment read. Another countered, the girl probably didn't have the right paperwork. Stop jumping to conclusions. The phone vibrated in his hand as notifications poured in. Texts, emails, and missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Gideon barely had time to process it all before the door to Emily's room creaked open. She stepped out, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. Dad, what's happening? She asked, her voice small. Gideon hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. There's a video of what happened at the airport. People are talking about it online. Emily's eyes widened. About me? He nodded. Yes, but don't worry, we'll handle it. Her lips trembled. I don't want people to see me like that. Gideon reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. You did nothing wrong, Emily. Remember that. Whatever happens, we'll get through this together. By midday, the story had gained enough traction to catch the attention of local news outlets. Reporters began calling, seeking interviews with Gideon and Emily. The attention was overwhelming, but Gideon knew he couldn't stay silent. If he wanted justice for his daughter, he needed to control the narrative. Later that afternoon, Gideon sat across from a journalist in their modest living room. Emily opted to stay in her room, unwilling to face the cameras. The reporter, a young woman with a notepad and an empathetic smile, asked question after question. Gideon recounted the events as truthfully as he could, his words measured but firm. Do you believe Sandra Miller acted out of racial bias? The reporter asked, her pen poised above the paper. Gideon hesitated. I believe her actions were unfair and unwarranted. Whether race played a role, that's something only she can answer. The interview aired that evening, sparking even more debate. Some viewers praised Gideon for standing up for his daughter, while others accused him of seeking attention. The influx of opinions only added to the pressure he felt. The next day, the airline issued a public statement. A well-dressed spokesperson stood behind a podium, flanked by the company logo. The press conference was broadcast live, with reporters shouting questions over each other. Our flight attendant, Sandra Miller, was following standard protocol for ensuring passenger safety, the spokesperson declared. While we regret the distress caused, our team acted in accordance with established guidelines. The statement did little to quell the uproar. If anything, it added fuel to the fire. Gideon couldn't help but feel enraged by the company's refusal to acknowledge the harm done to Emily. It was as if they were more concerned with protecting their image than addressing the truth. Later that evening, Lila called. "Gideon, we need to dig deeper. I've been looking into Sandra Miller's background, and there's something you should know." "What is it?" Gideon asked, his pulse quickening. "She's connected to a senior manager at the airline, David Harrington. He's been with the company for years, and there are whispers that he shields certain employees, Sandra included." Gideon clenched his jaw. "Why would he do that?" "I don't know yet," Lila admitted. "But if Sandra has someone like him in her corner, this fight just got a lot harder." Gideon sat back, the weight of Lila's words sinking in. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about a system that enabled and protected her actions. And if he was going to stand up against it, he'd need more than determination. He'd need undeniable proof. Sandra Miller adjusted her perfectly pressed uniform as she sat before the bright lights of the interview set. The airline had chosen her as the face of their public defense, a calculated move meant to humanize her role in the incident that had sparked outrage across social media. She looked composed, confident even, but the tension in her jaw betrayed the strain she was under. The reporter, a seasoned journalist with a knack for probing questions, leaned forward, her eyes sharp behind thin-frame glasses. "Ms. Miller, can you explain the events that led to your decision to deny boarding to Emily Carter?" Sandra clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "Safety is always our top priority," she began, her voice measured and rehearsed. "As a senior flight attendant, I have the authority to make decisions that ensure the well-being of all passengers. But some have accused you of unfairly targeting Emily Carter, suggesting your actions were motivated by bias rather than protocol," the reporter pressed. "How do you respond to that?" Sandra's carefully maintained composure cracked for a brief moment. Her lips tightened before she responded, her tone growing defensive. "I was protecting the flight from potential risks. That's my job. I don't have time to second-guess whether someone's documentation is legitimate when the safety of dozens of passengers is at stake." The reporter raised an eyebrow. "You considered a 14-year-old girl a risk to the flight?" Sandra blinked, realizing her misstep. She backtracked quickly, her words stumbling slightly. I didn't mean she was a risk personally, but protocols exist for a reason. It's not about individuals. It's about ensuring the overall safety." The interview ended shortly after, but the damage had been done. By the time the segment aired, Sandra's words had been clipped and shared widely online. "Flight attendant calls teen a potential risk" became the headline of the day, sparking a new wave of outrage. Gideon sat at his kitchen table, his laptop open as he watched the interview for the third time. Beside him, Lila leaned against the counter, her arms crossed and her expression grim. "She just handed us an opening," Lila said, her tone tinged with both disbelief and determination. "That line about risks, it's practically an admission that her actions were subjective." "She can't even keep her story straight," Gideon muttered, rewinding the video to play the incriminating statement again. "She said it wasn't personal, but everything about the way she treated Emily says otherwise." Lila nodded. "We need to act fast. This is the kind of thing we can use to build a stronger case. But it'll only work if we keep pushing. People are starting to see through her facade." The phone on the counter buzzed, interrupting their discussion. Gideon glanced at the screen. Another call from an unknown number. He ignored it, his focus returning to the video. "What's the next step?" he asked. "I'll reach out to a few advocacy groups," Lila replied. "If we can get them on board, it'll add more weight to the public pressure. Meanwhile, you need to keep documenting everything. Conversations, emails, anything you come across that ties Sandra to this pattern of behavior." As Lila spoke, Gideon's phone buzzed again. This time he picked it up. "Hello? Mr. Carter," an unfamiliar voice said. "This is Daniel Graves from Airport Administration. We need you to come in for a meeting, immediately." Gideon frowned. "What's this about?" "It's regarding your conduct over the past few days," Graves replied, his tone clipped. "We've received complaints that your actions are causing disruptions. I'd prefer to discuss this in person." The call ended before Gideon could respond. He set the phone down, a new wave of unease washing over him. They're coming after me now, he said, looking up at Lila. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? Airport administration. They're claiming I'm causing disruptions. Sounds like they're setting me up for a suspension or worse. Lila's expression darkened. They're trying to shut you down. They know you're too close to something. Gideon stood, his hands braced against the edge of the table. I'm not backing down. Not now. No, you're not, Lila said firmly. But you need to be careful. They're playing dirty and they'll use anything they can to discredit you. Whatever happens in that meeting, keep your cool. Don't give them any ammunition. Gideon nodded, but his mind was already racing. The stakes were rising, and the weight of it all felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. He had started this fight for Emily, but it was becoming clear that the battle extended far beyond his daughter. This was about confronting a system that thrived on silence, and Gideon was determined to make his voice heard. The air in the staff locker room was thick with tension as Gideon entered, his footsteps echoing against the tile floor. Conversations that had been flowing moments earlier came to an abrupt halt. Several colleagues glanced his way, some offering tight-lipped nods, others avoiding eye contact entirely. It was a stark contrast to the camaraderie he had once known here, and it didn't take long for him to realize that word had spread about his battle against the airline. Morning, he said, forcing his voice to sound steady, though the silence that followed made his greeting feel hollow. He set his bag down on the bench and began changing into his uniform, pretending not to notice the sideways glances and murmured whispers. From behind him, a familiar voice broke the uneasy quiet. Gideon. He turned to see Marcus standing a few feet away, his expression conflicted. Can I talk to you for a second? Gideon nodded, following Marcus to a corner of the room where they could speak privately. What's going on? He asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. Marcus hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before lowering his voice. Look, I'm on your side, man, but some of the others, they think you're stirring up trouble. A few of them are worried this is going to make things harder for everyone. Gideon frowned. Harder how? By calling out injustice? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. You know how it is. Management doesn't like waves. If they feel like someone's a liability, they'll crack down on everyone to set an example. Liability? Gideon repeated, his voice rising slightly. I'm standing up for my daughter, for what's right. How does that make me a liability? I get it, I do, Marcus said quickly, but not everyone sees it that way. They're scared, and scared people look for someone to blame. Gideon shook his head, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. I'm not going to apologize for doing what's right. If that makes people uncomfortable, so be it. Marcus sighed, his shoulders slumping. Just watch your back, all right? Not everyone's as brave as you. Gideon returned to his routine, but the atmosphere remained cold. The once familiar banter among colleagues had been replaced with stilted exchanges and veiled stares. By the end of his shift, the isolation weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of the cost of standing up against the system. When he arrived home that evening, Emily was sitting on the couch, her knees tucked under her chin. She didn't look up as he walked in, her gaze fixed on the muted television. Gideon set his bag down and approached her cautiously. Hey, kiddo, he said, sitting down beside her. How was your day? She shrugged, her silence more telling than any words. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Why can't we just drop this? Gideon blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? I mean, all of it, Emily said, turning to face him. The meetings, the news, the lawyers. It's too much, Dad. I just want things to go back to normal. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on fighting for her that he hadn't stopped to consider the toll it was taking on her. Emily, I'm doing this for you, he said, his tone soft but firm. What happened to you wasn't right. And if we don't stand up to it, it'll keep happening. To other kids, to other families. But it's not helping, she said, her voice cracking. It's making everything worse. People at school are staring at me. They're talking about me like I'm some kind of problem. Gideon reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. I know this is hard, he said gently, but sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy. It's messy and it hurts, but it's worth it. Emily pulled away, her expression a mix of frustration and sadness. I just want to be left alone, she said before retreating to her room, the door clicking shut behind her. Gideon sat there for a long time, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had always thought of himself as a protector, someone who could shield his family from harm. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that his fight was causing more pain than it was solving. As the evening wore on, he tried to focus on preparing documents for Lila, but his mind kept drifting back to Emily. The guilt gnawed at him, but so did the conviction that he couldn't back down. Not now, not when they were so close to exposing the truth. Just as he was about to call it a night, a sharp knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find no one there, but a plain white envelope lay on the doorstep. Frowning, he picked it up and brought it inside. When he opened it, his blood ran cold. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "If you don't stop, you'll regret it. This is your only warning." Gideon stared at the words, his hands trembling. The fight was no longer just about justice. It was becoming dangerous. But instead of fear, a steely resolve settled over him. Whoever had sent the threat had underestimated one thing. Gideon Carter didn't back down. The weight of the anonymous threat lingered with Gideon as he navigated through his next shift at the airport. The envelope sat hidden in his bag, but its words echoed in his mind, a stark reminder of the stakes involved. Yet the resolve that had anchored him from the beginning remained firm. He knew backing down now would only embolden those seeking to silence him. By the time he finished his shift and made his way to Lila's office downtown, the exhaustion from the day was overtaken by the anticipation of their meeting. Lila had called him that afternoon, her voice carrying an urgency he hadn't heard before. The office was small but bustling, with the hum of printers and soft murmurs of conversation filling the space. Lila greeted him at the door, her expression serious. "We've got a lead," she said, motioning for him to follow her inside. She closed the door behind him and gestured toward a stack of papers spread across her desk. "What is it?" Gideon asked, his eyes scanning the clutter. "Something big," Lila said, sitting down and gesturing for him to do the same. "I was contacted by someone who used to work for the airline. Someone who knows Sandra's history and the company's policies better than anyone." Gideon leaned forward, his interest piqued. "And?" "They provided internal documents," Lila continued, her voice steady but charged with excitement. "Emails, reports, everything we need to prove that Sandra wasn't acting on her own. She was following directives, Gideon. This wasn't just a one-off incident. It's part of a systemic issue." Gideon's chest tightened. "You're saying they've been targeting people like Emily? Deliberately?" Lila nodded, pushing a printed email across the desk toward him. "This one is from a few months ago. It's addressed to a select group of senior staff, including Sandra. It outlines guidelines for handling problematic passengers, which based on context seems to mean anyone who doesn't fit a certain profile." Gideon picked up the email, his hands trembling slightly as he read the cold, detached language. Phrases like "minimize risk through selective discretion" and "flag passengers with potential for non-compliance" jumped out at him, each one more damning than the last. "And there's more," Lila added, pulling out another document. "This report lists incidents where Sandra specifically flagged passengers. The details are vague, but the patterns are clear. Overwhelmingly, the people she targeted were minorities, young travelers, or those who seemed inexperienced." Gideon exhaled sharply, the anger rising in his chest. "They've been letting her get away with this for years." "It gets worse," Lila said, her tone darkening. "There's evidence that higher-ups have been shielding her. She has a close relationship with David Harrington, the senior manager I mentioned before. He signed off on every incident report she's filed, no matter how questionable." The revelation was a gut punch, confirming Gideon's worst fears. This wasn't just about Sandra's actions. It was about a culture of discrimination embedded within the airline itself. "What do we do with this?" Gideon asked, his voice low but firm. "We build our case," Lila replied. "This is exactly the kind of evidence we've been looking for. If we play this right, we can expose the entire system." As they worked through the night, piecing together the information, Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to tip the scales. The documents were damning, yes, but the risk of retaliation loomed large. His mind flickered to Emily and the life he had worked so hard to build for her. Was he prepared to jeopardize it all? Near midnight, Lila slid a final stack of papers across the desk, her gaze meeting his. "This is the foundation of our case," she said. "With this, we can take on the airline and win." Gideon stared at the documents, the weight of the moment sinking in. He could feel the enormity of what they were about to undertake, the path ahead fraught with uncertainty and danger. But then he thought of Emily's tear-streaked face, her voice cracking as she asked why they couldn't just let it go. No, he couldn't let it go. Not now. Lila's voice cut through his thoughts. "But Gideon, you need to be sure. This is going to get messy. Once we release this, there's no turning back. They'll come after you. Hard." He met her gaze, his jaw set with determination. "Let them. I've got nothing left to lose." Lila leaned back, studying him for a moment before nodding. "All right," she said. "Then let's make them pay." The room was packed. Journalists from local newspapers, national outlets, and even online bloggers crammed into the modest conference space, their cameras poised and microphones extended. The hum of murmured conversations filled the air, a palpable tension hanging over the gathering. Gideon stood at the front, flanked by Lila, her presence a steadying force beside him. On his other side was Emily, her small frame radiating a quiet strength. She had insisted on being here, despite Gideon's protests. "Dad," she had said earlier that morning, her voice firm, "this isn't just your fight. It's mine too." Now as he faced the crowd, Gideon adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. The room fell silent, dozens of eyes trained on him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to focus on why he was here. He took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon. My name is Gideon Carter, and for over a decade, I've worked as a security officer at Asheville Regional Airport. But today, I'm not here as an employee. I'm here as a father." He paused, his voice steady but charged with emotion. 2 weeks ago, my daughter Emily was humiliated and denied boarding by an employee of Ridgeway Airlines. What should have been a simple, joyful moment for her turned into an experience of shame and fear. Gideon gestured to the screen behind him, where copies of the incriminating documents Lila had obtained were projected. This wasn't an isolated incident. Thanks to the courage of a former airline employee, we now have proof that Ridgeway Airlines has been operating under a discriminatory policy, a policy that disproportionately targets people like my daughter. The room erupted into murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously as the weight of his words sank in. Gideon stepped back, motioning for Lila to take over. She approached the microphone, her tone firm and authoritative. "These documents reveal a troubling pattern," she said. "Passengers flagged for extra scrutiny based on subjective criteria. Employees instructed to prioritize discretionary authority over fairness and transparency. This is systemic discrimination, plain and simple." Lila's words hit like a hammer, silencing the crowd. She turned to Emily, offering her a small, reassuring nod. Gideon's stomach clenched as his daughter stepped forward, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "My name is Emily Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly before she steadied herself. "I didn't understand why I was being treated the way I was. I just knew it felt wrong. I'm here today because no one should feel like they don't belong, just because of who they are." Gideon watched her with a mix of pride and heartache. He knew how much courage it took for her to stand here, in front of all these strangers, and share her pain. The applause that followed was a small but meaningful acknowledgement of her bravery. As the press conference ended, Gideon and Lila fielded a barrage of questions from reporters, the room buzzing with energy. But the victory was short-lived. That evening, Ridgeway Airlines issued a statement condemning Gideon's allegations. "Mr. Carter's claims are baseless and defamatory," the statement read. "Our policies are designed to prioritize passenger safety, and any suggestion of bias is both untrue and deeply offensive. We are exploring legal options to address this false and damaging narrative." The response hit the news cycle like wildfire. Talk shows debated the issue, some defending the airline's stance while others praised Gideon's courage. Social media exploded with hashtags, both supportive and critical. The pressure mounted, but Gideon refused to back down. Late that night, as he sat in his living room, sifting through more emails and messages, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. He opened it, his eyes narrowing as he read the words. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Gideon stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. Whoever had sent it wanted him to feel powerless, to second-guess every step he'd taken. But instead of fear, the message fueled his determination. He knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. The knock on the door came just as Gideon was going over the day's chaos in his mind. The soft but deliberate rapping sent a shiver through him, an ominous echo in the quiet of the night. He exchanged a glance with Emily, who had been seated across the room scrolling through her phone. She looked up, her eyes wary. "Stay here," Gideon said, his voice calm but firm. He approached the door, his body tense as he opened it. A man in a tailored gray suit stood on the porch, his posture exuding practiced confidence. He held a slim briefcase in one hand and offered a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Carter," the man began, his tone smooth and measured. "My name is Anthony Greer. I'm here on behalf of Ridgeway Airlines." Gideon's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" Greer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the inside of the house. "May I come in?" "This is a private matter." Gideon hesitated but stepped aside, motioning toward the living room. Greer entered, his polished shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. He glanced briefly at Emily, offering a nod before setting his briefcase on the coffee table. "I'll make this quick," Greer said, sitting down and opening the briefcase with an audible snap. He pulled out a sleek folder and slid it toward Gideon. "Ridgeway is prepared to resolve this matter amicably. We understand your grievances and are willing to make amends." Gideon crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "Amends? By covering up what happened?" Greer's smile remained intact, but his tone cooled. "We're offering to restore your position at the airport, along with a substantial financial settlement for your family. In exchange, we'll need you to drop any legal action and refrain from further public statements." Gideon didn't reach for the folder. "And what about Emily? What about the policies that let Sandra get away with what she did?" Greer's expression hardened. "Mr. Carter, I'm here to offer a solution, not debate the past. The airline stands by its position that no wrongdoing occurred. However, we recognize the need to move forward, for everyone's sake." Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers gripping her phone. Gideon could feel her unease, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. "I'm not interested," Gideon said firmly, his voice steady. "You can take your money and your job offer and shove it." Greer leaned back slightly, his smile now completely gone. "You're making a mistake. This isn't just about you anymore. Think about your daughter, about her future. Do you really want her dragged through the mud for the sake of your pride?" Gideon's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice calm. "This isn't about pride. It's about doing what's right. You can't buy my silence, and you sure as hell can't buy my integrity." Greer's eyes narrowed, and he stood, gathering his briefcase. "You'll regret this," he said coldly. "No one takes on Ridgeway Airlines and walks away unscathed." As Greer left, slamming the door behind him, Gideon turned to Emily. She stared at him, her face pale but resolute. "Dad," she said softly, "was that the right thing to do?" Gideon knelt in front of her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Yes, it was, because some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." The next morning, Lila arrived at Gideon's house with a look on her face that spoke volumes. She wasted no time, setting her bag on the kitchen counter and pulling out a stack of papers. "I found something," she said, spreading the documents across the table. "Sandra Miller isn't just protected, she's untouchable." Gideon frowned, leaning over the papers. "What do you mean?" Lila pointed to an email chain. "This is between Sandra and David Harrington, a senior executive at Ridgeway. He's been pulling strings for her for years, covering up complaints, dismissing investigations, even promoting her despite documented misconduct." Gideon felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "Why? What's their connection?" Lila hesitated. "I don't have all the details yet, but it's personal. Family maybe, or something deeper. Whatever it is, he's gone to great lengths to protect her." Before Gideon could respond, his phone buzzed. He picked it up, frowning at the unknown number. The text message that flashed on the screen sent a chill down his spine. Your fight ends now. Walk away or you'll lose everything. He showed the message to Lila, who read it with a grim expression. They're getting desperate, she said. That means we're getting close. Gideon nodded, his resolve hardening. Let them come. I'm not stopping. Lila placed a hand on his arm, her voice steady but filled with urgency. Gideon, we can do this. We can bring them down. But you have to be ready. They'll throw everything they have at us. I'm ready, Gideon said, his voice unyielding. It's time to show them they can't bury the truth. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting golden streaks across the living room floor. Emily sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on a point far beyond the walls of their home, her mind churning with thoughts she hadn't yet found the courage to voice. Gideon sat across from her, his expression weary but expectant. He had learned to recognize the look on her face, a battle waging within her, silently and intensely. Emily, he said gently, breaking the silence, you don't have to do anything you're not ready for. This is my fight. Emily looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. Dad, this isn't just your fight, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It's ours. I've been thinking about what happened and how it felt to stand there, being treated like I didn't belong. I don't want anyone else to feel that way. Gideon leaned forward, his heart swelling with both pride and apprehension. You've been through enough already. No one would blame you for stepping back. She shook her head, determination hardening her features. I've been stepping back for too long. I was scared, Dad, scared of what people would say, scared of being in the spotlight. But this isn't about me anymore. If I don't speak up, who will? Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Gideon felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on protecting her that he hadn't considered how much strength she might be carrying within her. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Emily nodded. I want to be a part of this. I want to tell the truth. Gideon exhaled deeply, pride and concern warring within him. All right, he said. If this is what you want, we'll do it together. The next day, Lila came over to prepare them for the upcoming trial. The air was tense but purposeful as they reviewed the evidence, rehearsed statements, and discussed what to expect in court. Emily asked questions, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. Lila answered each one with patience, her calm demeanor helping to ease some of the tension. As they worked, the doorbell rang. Gideon frowned, exchanging a glance with Lila before heading to the door. When he opened it, he was met by a man in his early 40s, dressed in a plain shirt and jeans. His expression was guarded but sincere. My name's Paul Garrett, the man said, holding up a small folder. I used to work for Ridgeway Airlines. I heard about your case, and I think I have something that can help. Gideon stepped aside to let him in, his curiosity piqued. Paul sat down at the dining table, placing the folder in front of him. I was a manager for 6 years before I left. I couldn't stand what they were doing anymore. What exactly were they doing? Lila asked, her tone sharp. Paul hesitated, his gaze shifting to Emily before returning to Gideon. It was all about optics. The company wanted flights to run smoothly, no matter what. They'd tell us to target certain passengers, anyone who looked like they might cause delays or complaints. They called it proactive management. Sandra Miller was one of their enforcers. She didn't just act on her own. She was following orders. Gideon clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. You're saying this was a directive from higher-ups? Paul nodded. I've got emails, internal memos, everything you need to prove it. I've been holding on to this stuff for years, but I didn't know what to do with it. When I saw your story, I realized it was time. Lila reached for the folder, her expression unreadable as she flipped through its contents. As she scanned the documents, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. This is exactly what we needed, she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. Thank you, Paul. You've just strengthened our case tenfold. Paul stood to leave, his shoulders visibly lighter. I hope it helps, he said. It's about time someone held them accountable. After he left, Lila turned to Gideon and Emily, her eyes gleaming with determination. This is it, she said. We have everything we need to expose them. The following morning, the courthouse was a hive of activity. Reporters and camera crews swarmed the entrance, their lenses trained on anyone who approached. As Gideon and Emily stepped out of the car, the cacophony of shouted questions and flashing cameras hit them like a wave. Lila walked beside them, her presence a steadying force. Emily held her head high, her grip on Gideon's hand firm. She had made her decision, and now there was no turning back. As they approached the courthouse steps, Gideon caught sight of Sandra Miller standing near the entrance, flanked by her lawyers. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time he saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. The trial was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as spectators, reporters, and legal teams filed into their respective seats. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Gideon's shoulders as he sat at the plaintiff's table with Emily by his side. Lila organized their materials with a precision that exuded confidence, but even she couldn't completely mask the tension simmering beneath the surface. The judge entered, and the room fell silent as everyone rose. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise!" The Honorable Judge, Naomi Richards, presiding. As the judge took her seat, her stern expression set the tone for what was to come. The opening statements were formalities, each side laying out their narrative. Ridgeway Airlines lead attorney, a sharp-witted man named Charles Delaney, painted the company as a beacon of professionalism, emphasizing their unwavering commitment to passenger safety. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Delaney began, pacing with practiced ease, "our client, Ridgeway Airlines, has always operated with integrity and adherence to industry standards. The actions taken by our employee, Sandra Miller, were not only within protocol but necessary to ensure the safety of all passengers on board. Any assertion otherwise is, frankly, a misrepresentation of the truth." Gideon clenched his jaw as Delaney's words filled the room, painting Sandra as a diligent professional rather than the agent of discrimination he knew her to be. Lila's turn came next. She stood with measured grace, her voice clear and deliberate as she addressed the jury. "This case is not about protocol or safety. It's about a young girl who was humiliated and denied her basic dignity. It's about a company that has systematically allowed discriminatory practices to go unchecked, prioritizing optics over justice." Her words hung in the air, drawing nods from a few jurors. Then the testimonies began. Emily was called first. As she took the stand, her small frame seemed almost lost in the chair, but her voice carried a quiet strength. Lila guided her through the initial questions, giving her space to recount the events of that fateful day. "When I handed over my boarding pass," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly, "Sandra Miller looked at me like I didn't belong there. She told me to step aside, and I didn't understand why. I had done everything right. My dad made sure of it." Lila nodded encouragingly. "And how did that make you feel, Emily?" Emily paused, her gaze flickering toward Gideon before settling on the jury. "I felt small, like I didn't matter, like I was a problem just because of who I am." The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words palpable. Even Delaney's confident demeanor faltered slightly, his pen stilling on the legal pad before him. When cross-examining Emily, Delaney tread carefully, clearly aware that any misstep could alienate the jury. He focused on protocol, attempting to frame Sandra's actions as a misunderstanding rather than malice. But Emily's unflinching honesty and composure left little room for doubt. Next, Sandra was called to testify. Her lawyer's questioning was designed to humanize her, to present her as a professional, simply doing her job under challenging circumstances. "Ms. Miller," Delaney began, "can you describe the training and guidelines Ridgeway Airlines provides for handling passengers?" Sandra nodded, her tone measured. "We're trained to identify potential risks and ensure the safety of the flight. My actions that day were in line with those guidelines." Lila's cross-examination, however, was relentless. "Miss Miller," she said, pacing slightly, "do you consider a 14-year-old girl, traveling with all required documentation, a potential risk?" Sandra hesitated, her carefully constructed composure cracking slightly. "It's not about the individual, it's about following procedures." Lila pounced on the hesitation. "So you're saying your judgment that day wasn't influenced by Emily's appearance or demeanor? That it was purely procedural?" Sandra shifted in her seat. I can't answer that definitively." Before the court could fully digest Sandra's testimony, Lila introduced a new piece of evidence, a recently obtained recording. The tension in the room mounted as the bailiff set up the playback equipment. Gideon exchanged a glance with Lila, her steady nod assuring him that this was their moment. The recording crackled to life, Sandra's voice unmistakable. Look, sometimes you just have to weed out the troublemakers before they even get on board. It's easier that way. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the jury's expressions ranging from shock to disapproval. The judge's gavel brought order, but the damage was done. The evidence was damning, and Sandra's attempts to backtrack during questioning only deepened the impression of guilt. As the day's proceedings wrapped up, Sandra leaned toward Delaney, whispering something that caused his brow to furrow. Moments later, he requested a recess, citing confidential matters requiring immediate attention. The courtroom emptied, but Gideon and Lila stayed behind, discussing strategy. Meanwhile, Sandra was seen speaking urgently with Delaney in a side room, her gestures animated and her expression tense. "What do you think that's about?" Gideon asked, watching through the glass panel of the door. Lila's eyes narrowed. "Whatever it is, it can't be good, but if she's starting to crack, we might be closer to the truth than we thought." The courtroom was charged with tension as Sandra Miller took the stand for the second time. The once confident demeanor she carried had visibly cracked, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone in front of her. Every eye in the room was trained on her, the weight of judgment pressing heavily. Gideon sat at the plaintiff's table, his fists clenched as he watched her prepare to defend the indefensible. Lila stood, her sharp gaze cutting through the silence. "Ms. Miller," she began, her tone controlled but piercing, "you've testified that your actions were in line with Ridgeway Airlines protocols. That's correct?" Sandra nodded hesitantly. "Yes, that's correct." Lila paced slowly, her voice calm but deliberate. "And you've claimed that these protocols were created to ensure passenger safety? Is that still your position?" "Yes," Sandra replied, though the confidence in her voice was fading. Lila stopped, turning to face her directly. "Then let me ask you this. Do you believe that denying boarding to a 14-year-old girl with valid documentation was truly a matter of safety? Or was it a matter of optics?" Sandra's lips tightened. "I followed the guidelines as they were provided to me. I didn't make those decisions on my own." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and the judge banged her gavel for silence. Lila pressed on, her tone growing sharper. "Ms. Miller, isn't it true that those guidelines included instructions to single out passengers based on their appearance and perceived compliance?" "That's not how it was phrased," Sandra muttered, avoiding eye contact. "But that's how it was applied, wasn't it?" Lila stepped closer to the witness stand, her voice slicing through Sandra's faltering defenses. "Passengers like Emily Carter weren't flagged for safety concerns. They were targeted because they didn't fit a certain image. Isn't that right?" Sandra's silence spoke volumes. Gideon leaned forward, his pulse quickening as he saw her struggle to maintain composure. Finally, she exhaled sharply, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I didn't have a choice," she admitted. "I was just following orders." The room erupted, reporters scrambling to capture her words. The judge's gavel rang out again, restoring order as Lila seized the moment. "Following orders," Lila repeated, her tone heavy with disdain. "Ms. Miller, do you believe that absolves you of responsibility? Do you believe what you did to Emily Carter was right?" Sandra hesitated, her eyes darting toward Ridgeway's legal team, who sat rigidly at their table. Finally, she shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, it wasn't right." The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Lila turned to the jury, her expression resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard it from Ms. Miller herself. This was not about safety. It was about systemic discrimination, sanctioned and enforced by Ridgeway Airlines." Lila returned to her table, her movements precise as she retrieved a folder. "And now I'd like to present our final piece of evidence." She handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "This is an email sent from Ridgeway's senior management to a select group of employees, including Ms. Miller. In it, they explicitly instruct staff to selectively monitor passengers based on appearance and demeanor under the guise of maintaining efficiency." The email was displayed on the courtroom screen, the damning language highlighted for all to see. Gasps and whispers filled the room as the implications became clear. Gideon felt a surge of vindication as he watched the jury's expressions shift, their disbelief turning to outrage. Sandra buried her face in her hands, the final blow landing squarely. The judge called for a recess, giving the room a moment to process the gravity of the revelation. As the room emptied, Gideon turned to Lila, his voice low. "We've got them." Lila nodded, her expression serious. "We've exposed the truth, but don't expect them to admit defeat easily." Her words proved prophetic. Within hours, Ridgeway Airlines issued a public statement claiming they would conduct a thorough internal investigation into the allegations. The announcement was broadcast widely, but Gideon saw it for what it was, a calculated attempt to buy time and mitigate damage. Back in the courtroom, Sandra sat alone at the defense table, her once imposing presence reduced to a shadow of itself. Gideon approached her, his voice quiet but firm. "You could have stopped this," he said. "You had the choice to do the right thing." Sandra didn't look up. "You don't know what it's like to be under their control," she whispered. "They hold everything over you, your job, your reputation, your life." Gideon straightened, his resolve hardening. "Maybe, but that doesn't make it right." As he walked away, the weight of the fight still loomed large, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The system they were up against was powerful, but it wasn't infallible. Piece by piece, they were dismantling the facade. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as the final day of the trial began. Spectators filled every seat, and the tension was palpable. Gideon stood at the plaintiff's table, his hands resting firmly on the polished wood, his mind racing with the weight of what was to come. Emily sat beside him, her posture straight, her young face set with quiet determination. Lila, always composed, shuffled through papers with a calm efficiency that belied the intensity of the moment. The judge's gavel brought the room to order, and all eyes turned toward Gideon as he rose to deliver his closing statement. He had prepared for this moment with Lila's guidance, but as he stood there, the rehearsed words felt distant and impersonal. He pushed the script aside, took a deep breath, and let his heart guide him. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This case is about more than what happened to my daughter, Emily, on that day. It's about a system that allows prejudice to hide behind policies, that permits discrimination to masquerade as protocol." He turned to the jury, his eyes meeting each of theirs. "My daughter did nothing wrong. She followed every rule, every requirement, and yet she was made to feel small, to feel like she didn't belong. That's a pain no child should ever have to endure." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. He continued, his voice growing stronger. "But this isn't just about Emily. It's about every person who's ever been judged, not for who they are, but for what they look like. It's about standing up to a culture that says, 'Stay silent, don't make waves.' Well, I refuse to stay silent, and I hope that by standing here today, I've shown my daughter, and anyone watching, that doing what's right is always worth it." Gideon stepped back, his chest rising and falling as he finished. The courtroom remained silent for a moment, and then a ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Lila placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder as he sat down, her expression one of quiet pride. The defense made their closing arguments, but the impact of Gideon's speech lingered. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room buzzed with speculation. Hours passed, each minute stretching unbearably. Emily leaned against Gideon, her presence grounding him in the midst of the storm. Finally, the jury filed back in, their faces giving little away. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat as the room fell silent. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Gideon Carter, and his daughter, Emily Carter," she announced. "We recommend that Ridgeway Airlines issue a formal public apology and provide monetary compensation for damages." The words washed over Gideon like a wave, the weight of months of struggle and fear finally lifting. He turned to Emily, who was smiling through tears, and pulled her into a tight embrace. Around them, the courtroom erupted in reactions, some applauding, others murmuring in disbelief. But Gideon wasn't finished. The judge allowed him one final moment to speak, and he stepped forward again, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "To everyone listening," he said, "this victory isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who's ever felt powerless, who's ever been told to stay quiet. I hope this is a reminder that when we stand together, when we speak out, change is possible. The courtroom buzzed with emotion as Gideon stepped back to his seat. Emily remained by his side, holding his hand tightly. Reporters began to gather outside the courthouse, their cameras and microphones waiting to capture the moment. As the session adjourned, the judge offered a solemn nod to Gideon and Emily before exiting the courtroom. The crowd began to disperse, but Emily remained standing near the witness stand, her gaze fixed on her father. "Dad," she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise, "I'm so proud of you." Gideon's throat tightened as he looked at her, the strength and resilience in her eyes a testament to everything they had endured. "I'm proud of you too, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did this together." The two of them stood there for a moment, the chaos of the world around them fading into the background. This was their victory, a testament to courage, to love, and to the unshakable bond between a father and his daughter. The courtroom victory lingered in Gideon's mind as he and Emily walked through the courthouse doors. Outside, the air buzzed with the excitement of reporters and supporters, their voices mingling in a cacophony of questions, cheers, and camera shutters. For a brief moment, Gideon paused on the steps, looking out at the crowd. Emily's hand was firmly in his, her grip steady despite the whirlwind surrounding them. "Dad," she said softly, tugging his arm. "Let's go." He nodded, leading her through the throng of people. The questions came fast and furious. "Mr. Carter, how do you feel about the verdict? Emily, what's next for you? Do you think Ridgeway Airlines will follow through on the apology?" Gideon offered polite nods and brief acknowledgments, but kept moving, his focus solely on getting Emily to the car. Once inside the quiet sanctuary of the vehicle, the noise faded to a distant hum. Emily leaned back against the seat, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's finally over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Gideon glanced at her, his chest tightening with emotion. "Not over," he said gently. "Just this part. But you did more than anyone could have asked for, Emily. I'm so proud of you." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they drove home, the enormity of what they had accomplished began to settle in. The battle had been hard fought, but the fight had changed them both. Gideon felt lighter, as though a burden he'd carried for months had finally been lifted. Yet alongside the relief was the faint unease of what lay ahead. The following days brought a mix of reactions. Emily returned to school, greeted with an outpouring of support from her peers. Classmates who had once whispered behind her back now approached her with smiles and words of encouragement. "I saw the news," one girl said shyly as they waited in line for lunch. "You were really brave." Emily nodded, the praise still feeling unfamiliar, but warming her nonetheless. "Thanks," she replied, her voice more confident than it had been in weeks. At home, Gideon found himself grappling with a different set of challenges. While the verdict had been a moral victory, it came with professional repercussions. The airport administration, though careful not to retaliate overtly, made it clear that his position was tenuous. Tasks once delegated to others now fell squarely on his shoulders, the unspoken message of disapproval hanging in the air. "Just another test," he muttered to himself one evening as he sorted through a stack of reports at the kitchen table. Despite the uncertainty, he remained steadfast in his belief that the fight had been worth it. Later that week, as Emily worked on a school project in the living room, the doorbell rang. Gideon opened it to find a woman standing on the porch, dressed in professional attire with a warm but serious expression. "Mr. Carter?" she asked, extending a hand. "My name is Rachel Grant. I'm with the National Center for Civil Rights Advocacy." Gideon shook her hand, his brow furrowing slightly. "What can I do for you?" Rachel smiled faintly. "Actually, it's more about what we can do together. Your case has drawn national attention, and we believe it could set a precedent for similar cases. We'd like to discuss the possibility of working with you on future advocacy efforts." Gideon blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Advocacy," he repeated. Rachel nodded. "You've shown a tremendous ability to stand up for what's right, even under immense pressure. We think your voice could make a real difference in helping others who might not have the strength to fight on their own." Gideon glanced back at Emily, who was watching from the couch, her curiosity evident. He turned back to Rachel, his mind racing. The idea of continuing the fight, of using his experience to help others, was both daunting and invigorating. "I'll need to think about it," he said honestly. "This has been a long road." "Of course," Rachel replied. "Take all the time you need. Here's my card." She handed him a sleek business card, the organization's logo embossed in silver. "When you're ready, give me a call. We'd be honored to work with you." As Rachel left, Gideon stood in the doorway, the card in his hand. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing on him again, but this time it was accompanied by a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a father fighting for his daughter anymore. He was part of something bigger. Emily walked up beside him, her gaze shifting between the card and his face. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Gideon smiled, ruffling her hair gently. "I'm going to take it one step at a time, but whatever I do, it'll be for you, and for everyone like you." For the first time in months, the path ahead felt clear. It wouldn't be easy, but Gideon had never been one to shy away from a challenge. Together, he and Emily had faced the storm, and together they would help others weather theirs. The announcement came with little fanfare, but reverberated across the country. Ridgeway Airlines had called a press conference, their statement promising to address the allegations that had rocked the company to its core. The news spread quickly, drawing attention from media outlets, advocacy groups, and the general public. Gideon, Emily, and Lila watched the event unfold on their living room television, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The screen showed the company's CEO, a middle-aged man with a carefully composed expression, standing behind a sleek podium adorned with the Ridgeway Airlines logo. The room around him was filled with reporters, their cameras clicking incessantly. "Good afternoon," the CEO began, his voice steady but lacking warmth. "In light of recent events, Ridgeway Airlines acknowledges the need for significant changes within our organization. We are committed to rebuilding trust with our customers and the communities we serve." The words were measured, crafted by a team of public relations experts, but the next announcement caught Gideon's attention. Effective immediately, Ms. Sandra Miller is no longer employed by Ridgeway Airlines. Additionally, we are conducting a thorough review of our internal policies and training programs to ensure that incidents like this never happen again. Emily let out a small gasp, her eyes widening. "They actually fired her," she whispered. Gideon crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "It's a start," he said cautiously, though his skepticism was clear. The CEO continued, outlining plans for an external audit and new oversight measures. But the most significant development came at the end of his statement. Several members of Ridgeway's senior management team, including those involved in the creation and enforcement of discriminatory policies, have been called to testify before Congress. "We are fully cooperating with the investigation and remain committed to transparency." The room erupted in questions, reporters shouting over one another to be heard. The CEO raised his hands, signaling for calm, before stepping away from the podium. The press conference ended abruptly, leaving more questions than answers. "Congress," Lila said, leaning back on the couch. "That's huge. If they're forced to testify, this could go beyond just Ridgeway. It could set a precedent for the entire industry." Emily looked thoughtful, her gaze fixed on the now muted television. "Do you think they mean it? About changing?" Gideon sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I think they mean to save their reputation. But real change, that's up to all of us to keep pushing for." The following week brought a whirlwind of developments. News coverage of the congressional hearings dominated the airwaves, with senior executives from Ridgeway Airlines grilled by lawmakers about their policies and practices. Leaked emails and internal memos, many of which had been introduced during the trial, became central to the questioning. Sandra Miller, now a private citizen, gave a public statement of her own, apologizing for her role in the scandal. Her tone was contrite, but Gideon couldn't help but wonder if her remorse was genuine or a product of her newfound infamy. "I was part of a system that allowed prejudice to thrive," Sandra said, her voice trembling. "I should have spoken out sooner, but I didn't. For that, I am deeply sorry." Emily turned off the television after Sandra's statement, her face thoughtful. "She's right," she said softly. "She should have spoken out. But at least now, She's admitting it. Gideon nodded, his respect for Emily's empathy growing with each passing day. It takes courage to admit you were wrong, he said, but it takes even more to do something about it. The family's victory had inspired a wave of similar cases. Advocacy groups reported an uptick in passengers coming forward with their own stories of discrimination. The National Center for Civil Rights Advocacy, the organization that had reached out to Gideon, was already preparing for the next legal battles. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Emily broke the contemplative silence. "You know," she began, her tone measured, "if this hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't have understood how much unfairness people deal with every day." Gideon looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "And what do you think about that now?" Emily's expression was resolute. "I think sometimes we have to face injustice head on, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else it could happen to. Sometimes you have to stand up to change something bigger than yourself." Her words struck a chord, not just with Gideon, but with Lila as well. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her realization settling in. Gideon reached across the table, placing a hand on Emily's. "You're right," he said, "and you've already made a bigger difference than you realize." The next morning, Emily walked into school with her head held high. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of belonging, not just as Gideon Carter's daughter, but as someone who had found her voice and used it to make a difference. As for Gideon, he knew the fight wasn't over. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and systemic change would take time. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Hopeful for Emily's future, and for the world she was helping to shape. The auditorium was buzzing with quiet excitement as students filed in, their chatter echoing softly against the high ceilings. It was a rare occasion, an assembly dedicated not to sports or upcoming exams, but to a personal story. Emily sat backstage, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. Her heart pounded as she glanced at the folded notes in her hand, the words she had painstakingly prepared over the past week. "Ready?" A soft voice broke through her thoughts. It was Ms. Daniels, her English teacher and one of the event organizers. The kind smile on her face was enough to steady Emily's nerves, even if just a little. Emily nodded. "I think so." Ms. Daniels gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before stepping onto the stage to address the crowd. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Today we have a very special assembly. One of your fellow students has a story to share, a story about courage, resilience, and standing up for what's right. Please give a warm welcome to Emily Carter." The applause that followed was a mix of genuine support and polite obligation, but it was enough to nudge Emily forward. She stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her as she approached the microphone. Taking a deep breath, she scanned the room, finding familiar faces among the sea of students, some curious, others indifferent, but a few offering encouraging smiles. "Hi," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Emily Carter, and I want to tell you a story about something that happened to me." She paused, willing her voice to steady as she recounted the events of that day at the airport. She spoke of the humiliation, the confusion, and the fear she had felt, but also of the strength she had discovered within herself. She talked about her father, his unwavering support, and the long, exhausting fight for justice that had followed. "As scary as it was," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I realized that staying silent would have been worse. Because if I didn't speak up, nothing would change, and maybe someone else would have to go through what I did." The room was silent, the usual restlessness of an audience of teenagers replaced by an attentive stillness. Emily looked down at her notes, then back up, deciding to speak from the heart instead. "I guess what I'm trying to say is, sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy. It's scary and hard, and you might feel like you're all alone, but you're not. There are people who will stand with you, who will help you find your voice, and when you use it, you can make a difference." As she finished, the silence lingered for a moment before the applause erupted. This time, it was genuine, and it swelled in waves that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Emily exhaled, the weight of her nerves lifting as she stepped back from the microphone. After the assembly ended, a line of students formed around her, some simply offering quiet words of thanks. others asking more about her experience. Among them was a boy she recognized from her math class, shy and quiet, always sitting at the back of the room. "Hi, Emily," he said, his voice barely audible. "I just wanted to say thank you. What you said, it really hit home for me." Emily tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "Why's that?" The boy hesitated, then glanced around before continuing. I, I've dealt with stuff like that too. People judging me because of how I look or where I'm from. I've never talked about it before because I didn't think it would change anything. But hearing you today, I think maybe it's time I tried." Her chest tightened with a mix of emotions, pride, empathy, and a deep sense of connection. "That's really brave," she said. "And you're not alone, okay? If you ever want to talk, I'm here." The boy nodded, a small smile breaking through his nervous expression. "Thanks, Emily. That means a lot." As the day wound down, Emily returned to her locker to grab her things, her mind replaying the conversations she had had. When she opened her backpack, she noticed something unusual, a neatly folded piece of paper tucked inside. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she read the words. "Thank you for standing up. You've inspired more people than you know. Keep going." The note wasn't signed, but its message was clear. Emily held it for a moment, a quiet smile spreading across her face. She slipped it back into her bag, the simple gesture filling her with a renewed sense of purpose. Walking out of school that day, Emily felt lighter than she had in months. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time, she felt truly confident that her voice had made, and would continue to make, a difference. The morning air carried a crisp freshness as Gideon stepped into the Asheville Regional Airport for what he knew would be the last time. His badge hung loosely around his neck, its weight familiar, but now strangely unimportant. The terminal was alive with its usual rhythm, luggage wheels clattering, announcements echoing, travelers moving with purpose. For Gideon, however, this day marked a quiet end to one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. He had spent the previous night drafting his resignation letter, the words coming slower than he expected. The airport had been a constant in his life for over a decade, a place where he'd built relationships, faced challenges, and carved out a sense of purpose. Yet after everything that had transpired, it no longer felt like home. As he walked toward the security office, familiar faces greeted him. Some offered warm smiles, others nodded stiffly, their expressions still tinged with the tensions of the past months. Gideon greeted them all, his tone even, his steps measured. There was no anger in his heart, no lingering bitterness, just a deep resolve to move forward. Inside the security office, the hum of conversation quieted as Gideon entered. His supervisor, a gruff man named Bill Dawson, looked up from his desk. The room fell silent as Gideon approached, holding the letter in his hand. "Morning, Bill," Gideon said, his voice steady. Bill stood, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took the letter. "What's this?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "My resignation," Gideon replied. "Effective immediately." Bill sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I can't say I didn't see this coming," he admitted, setting the letter on his desk. "You've been through a lot, Carter, and whether we agreed or not, you stood for something. That's more than most people can say." The words took Gideon by surprise, and he offered a faint smile. "Thanks, Bill. For what it's worth, I don't regret any of it." As Gideon turned to leave, several of his colleagues stepped forward. Marcus, a young officer who had always looked up to Gideon, extended a hand. "You're one of the good ones, Gideon," he said, his voice sincere. "I learned a lot from you." Others echoed similar sentiments, their expressions softening as they said their goodbyes. Gideon took it all in, his heart full. The road to this moment had been anything but smooth, but it was clear that, despite the conflicts, he had left an indelible mark. By mid-afternoon, Gideon found himself in the offices of the National Center for Civil Rights Advocacy. The sleek, modern space was a stark contrast to the utilitarian halls of the airport, but it carried an energy that felt invigorating. Rachel Grant, the director who had first reached out to him, greeted him warmly. "Welcome aboard, Gideon," she said, extending a hand. "We're thrilled to have you." The day was filled with introductions, paperwork, and an overview of the organization's current initiatives. Gideon quickly realized that his work here would be different from anything he'd done before. It wasn't about enforcing rules or managing logistics. It was about fighting for something bigger. As the sun began to set, Gideon found himself alone in his new office. The desk was bare except for a single file folder labeled Ongoing Cases. He opened it, skimming through the summaries of individuals and families facing battles similar to his own. The stories were heart-wrenching, but they also ignited a fire within him. This was why he was here, to make a difference not just for Emily, but for countless others. That evening, Gideon returned home to find Emily waiting for him on the porch. She was holding a notebook, her face lit with curiosity. "How was it?" she asked, her eyes bright. "Different," Gideon admitted, sitting beside her. "But good. It feels right." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're going to help a lot of people, Dad." He looked at her, pride swelling in his chest. "I hope so. And you're part of that. What you've done, what you've been through, it's going to inspire people for years to come." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I had a good teacher." As the stars began to dot the night sky, Gideon felt a profound sense of peace. His journey had taken unexpected turns, challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it had brought him here, to a place where he could truly make a difference. For Gideon, justice was no longer just about standing against the wrongs he had experienced. It was about building something greater, about spreading hope to those who needed it most. And as he looked out into the night, he knew this was only the beginning. And so Gideon and Emily's journey reminds us of a powerful truth. Standing up against injustice isn't just about seeking fairness for ourselves. It's about paving the way for others to find their voice too. This story shows that courage and resilience can spark change in even the most rigid systems. What would you do if faced with a similar choice? Would you risk everything to fight for what's right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this waiting to inspire you. See you in the next video.